My story began with a death sentence.
My beginning is before AIDS.
She talked about this new disease. It was going to change the face of medicine in South Africa.
Very few of us had any understanding of the epidemic.
Really, I had absolute, complete faith in the fact that, science would prevail.
When the epidemic first came, I thought it really didn't concern us. It was a problem of white gay males in California, and that was a dreadful mistake because, as you've seen, from the 80s, we've become the worst affected country in the entire world.
We had HIV. We didn't have the drugs at that stage.
The drugs haven't arrived.
Who could afford to be on the antiretrovirals? And you were talking about $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
We had this real view that there was new hope. I think we were all a bit patient. We were saying, Mbeki comes to power and we need to allow him a bit of time to bed down. Same was true for Mantu.
What I kept hearing was, you wanted a policy on treatment, you've got it.
Some of the memories I have is of a lot of people dying, a lot of friends dying, personal confrontations that I had which were unpleasant with the former Minister of Health.
It was already known that the infection in children can be prevented, and yet they were still dragging off feet.
There was a bit of conflation of the issues. We then got into a bit of a debate which polarized us as a country.
As we grew, AIDS denialism hardened. As it hardened, we had to fight it harder. As we fought it harder, Thabo Mbeki, being a proud and arrogant man, hardened his position further, and unfortunately we got into a kind of, I think, vicious spiral.
There were very few people who supported us fighting Thabo Mbeki. And within the government itself, if there is a handful I can think of who stood up, it's a lot.
From an international perspective, we were embarrassed.
Bearing in mind that it's always been the case that an effective response will have to be a national response.
What moved and inspired and motivated you in those days was the personal interactions with people.
I think it's right to capture this history.
My beginning is 24th of December 1986, when I was diagnosed HIV positive at the age of 20. I was at the Johannesburg College of Education at the time, studying to become a teacher. It was during the December vacation. I collapsed one day at my vacation job and was rushed through to the Joburg Gen at the time. In casualty, was asked a few questions by the casualty doctor. She saw that I had a few swollen glands, asked if I had any weight loss, asked if I was homosexual, and for me it was the great awakening. I could come out publicly as being gay, and I said yes, I was. And she went out and came back a few minutes later and said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but you have AIDS and about 6 months left to live." And that was how my story began, with a death sentence. At the time, there was very little in South Africa in terms of HIV organizations, in terms of any type of counseling services. I recall that I was referred to Professor Ruben Scher at the South African Institute for Medical Research, which was one of the first HIV centers in the country, for some type of counseling. And the first 2 years of my HIV diagnosis, I was literally waiting to die. And every time I saw something in the media about a person with HIV looking very thin, very frail, I was anticipating that I was going to become that person. I think I also made the fateful error of telling my university lecturer that I was HIV positive at the beginning of the new academic year. And he went to the Vice-Chancellor and told the Vice-Chancellor, who went to the Chancellor, and they had a meeting and called me in and said they do not think that an AIDS victim would be able to teach children, and thought that it would be a good idea for me to leave and enjoy what time I had left. At the time I believed, at the time, because in the media HIV was a death sentence. HIV was, there was no future. People with HIV were not normal members of society. At the time, there wasn't anybody who was public in the country about being HIV positive. And so all I knew about HIV was what I read in the papers, what I saw on TV. I think Rock Hudson passed away 2 years before that. I think he died in 84 or 85. So, yeah. And that's my kind of image of that. But I believed them, and I left, which for me was very difficult, because I mean, ever since I was this high, I wanted to become a teacher, and it was my greatest passion to become a teacher. And of course, when I left university, my parents wanted to know, why are you leaving? You've always wanted to become a teacher. It's what you were dreamt about. And I couldn't tell them that I was HIV positive at the time. So I made up some story that it's not what I thought it would be. I wasn't very happy, so I decided to leave. Much to their dismay as well. I think that they were very surprised and very hurt.
Did they get angry with you?
My father got extremely angry because all the investment in education, and you're breaking your dreams, and why are you doing this, and I don't understand, you've always wanted to become a teacher. And so that was very difficult, and that was very painful.
Had you come out to your parents at this?
I had come out to my parents as being gay, which was something that wasn't spoken of, because I think my father kind of always believed, and still does believe, that I'm going to meet a nice blonde woman and settle down and get married and live happily. Yeah, exactly, and live happily ever after. I think it was harder for me to disclose. Well, I'll talk about my disclosure in a minute, but I found the whole process of disclosure to my parents a lot more difficult than I found disclosing that I was gay. But at the time in South Africa, there wasn't, this was now 87, 88, there wasn't anybody who was public. And everything that you saw in the media was linked to people looking very thin and very frail. The government at the time, which was obviously the apartheid government, was doing very little about HIV. And I remember them having the Yellow Hand campaign, which I think had something to do with Stop AIDS. And they had this horrible yellow hand. Yeah, and Amanda Holmshaw, who was at the time the director of the HIV program with Dr. Rena Fenter, who was this horrible Minister of Health who wore crimpling outfits and had her hair in a big bun, which was quite something.
This is sort of what, 89?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And they, Amanda actually contacted me because I was writing to them and saying to them, what are you doing about HIV? There's no public awareness, nobody really knows what's happening about HIV. Because I could not identify with the way that the media was portraying people with HIV. I was not thin or frail. I wasn't dying. I didn't have signs or symptoms. And I think there was an intrinsic need to respond to being defined as a victim, as a helpless victim, as a victim who was busy dying, as a victim who was guilty, as a victim who was sluttish, who was a prostitute, and being able to respond to all those issues. And I think that's, and also meeting two other people with HIV who had cycled from Joburg to Cape Town at the time. I can't remember their names. But they had cycled from Joburg to Cape Town and were supported by Mrs. Wendy Ackerman of Pick n Pay. And Pick n Pay has been one of the companies who got involved in HIV and AIDS very early on in the epidemic, especially Mrs. Ackerman. I think she was a real pioneer, and she also had a role to play in my development as an activist, and I'll come to that in a minute. And that's how I then wrote to the government at the time and said that they had to do something more about HIV. And Amanda Holmeshaw contacted me and said, "Are you prepared to help us? Are you prepared to get involved in an advertising campaign so that we can show how a normal person with HIV lives and how a normal person with HIV looks?" I was obviously very conflicted at the time because it was the apartheid government. But I just saw what HIV was doing, number one, to the gay community. And HIV was also beginning to move into the black community. And there was this kind of sense that AIDS was going to be the broom that would sweep society clean. I think they were struggling because of partly what was happening politically at the time, because this was 1991, 92. So there was change in the air. So they had to be seen to be doing something. And that's when they had this idea of having an advertising campaign which involved people with HIV, which at the time was fairly progressive, I think, for them. And they hired a huge PR company to come and take photos. I was living in Cape Town at the time, and they said, oh, it was just going to be a very small photo which would appear in the Department of Health newsletter and maybe in one or two magazines, which would be a picture of you and showing your story. There was absolutely nothing like informed consent or any implications of what could happen or what would happen with disclosure and if you'd come out, and absolutely nothing. So I just thought, well, I'm doing my cause. I've been arguing with them that they need to do something, and I participated. And I'll never forget the day. It was a Sunday. I was at the pool in Sea Point with a couple of friends, and I bought the Sunday Times, as I always do, and I was flipping through the Sunday Times, turned over the page, and there was a full page me staring at me from the newspaper, and it said Shaun Mellors, 24, loves to travel, great sense of humor, and at the bottom, completed his 2 years in the army, which is the lie, has AIDS, does not know how long he has to live. And I still have a copy of the newspaper article, because it was in the Sunday Times and the Report, which was the Afrikaans newspaper, the Afrikaans Sunday paper. And it was also in a number of magazines. I obviously closed it, but it was too late. I mean, they saw it. What was more painful, I think, was that that's how my parents found out that I was HIV positive. and my entire family. And part of my mother's side of the family is extremely conservative and very religious and very verkrampt. So for them to read in the Afrikaans newspaper that one of their family member has vigs, it was traumatic, and some of them haven't spoken to me ever since, or to my parents, because of the shame that it brought on the family. But that taught me a very valuable lesson in terms of disclosure. Because although it was my choice, I wasn't aware of the consequences. And there's, I think in any disclosure, it is obviously a choice, and there's always consequences, positive or negative. And it then became for me an important issue to ensure that I would be able to change the attitudes that I had encountered from that article, from friends and family. My parents initially did not want to talk to me. They were shocked. How could I bring on such shame to the family? I was fortunately in Cape Town and my parents were in Joburg, so I couldn't just climb into a car, or they couldn't just climb into a car and come and see me. But that in itself was then also an impetus to carry on doing what I was doing to bring about that change. No.
Conjecture about your emotional state, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't think suicide at that time crossed my mind at all. It was an intense feeling of shame initially. And that's also how Mrs. Ackerman came into my life, because Mrs. Ackerman also saw the newspaper advert. And at the time, one of her employees who belonged to our support group was in the Somerset Hospital, who was busy dying from AIDS. And that's how I met Mrs. Ackerman, because she came around to the hospital while I was visiting Jonathan. And she said that she saw me in the newspaper. If there's anything that she can ever do to help me, I must just let her know. And a few months later, there was the opportunity to attend an international conference for people with HIV, which was the International Conference for People with HIV in London. And I was, up until that time, a kind of lone crusader with, in South Africa, doing public talks to companies, doing road shows with Professor Ruben Scher, traveling around talking about the victim with HIV, and getting all the oh shames, and so how does it make you feel, and when are you going to die, and it was literally that kind of roadshow, and people not quite sure how to respond when you talk to a group of young students, and you could see the discomfort, and but I'm not like you, so I'm safe. And it was an incredible time, actually, because while trying to be public, there was also people within our circle of friends who were dying because there wasn't any treatment. And there was a deafening silence around HIV because we were so focused on the changeover. We were so focused on what was going to happen with the new South Africa, and all that was just taking up so much time. And
really overshadowed.
yeah. So, I mean, the ANC Health Desk before the takeover, through the Progressive Primary Healthcare Network, started working with us to organize the first NACOSA. At the time, it was the National AIDS Conference of South Africa. And
1992.
yeah, and But let me first come back to 1991, because that's when I travelled to London. I contacted Mrs. Ackerman, and I said to her, Mrs. Ackerman, I need to get to London because I want to attend this international conference. And she contacted her travel agent, and she sponsored my air ticket and my accommodation in London. And I flew on Sabina. Was that the Belgium airline? And it was my first time ever that I was traveling overseas. And it was huge excitement, and I traveled to London via Brussels. And it was this most amazing experience of my life. There were 500 other people with HIV from all over the world, all together.
You didn't have to be the poster boy anymore.
Exactly. And just talking, sharing, being able to feel as if you belong, as opposed to feeling like a victim.
Like a human petri dish being
shown around and
like a lab result.
Yeah. And I believe that that conference was my turning point as an advocate and as an activist, because I came back more inspired, I came back determined, and I came back with a fighting spirit to ensure that we do something in this country. And so I got involved with the Progressive Primary Healthcare Network, and at the time Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and Mantu Shabalala and Olive Shisana were all part of the Progressive Primary Healthcare Network. And in the lead up to the planning of the Nkosa meeting, I mean, we'd have the meetings in these posh hotels, and they'd all come and sit with us, and at the time you could smoke anywhere, and I was a smoker at the time, and Nkosazana always said, Shaun, I'll only come and sit with you if you quit smoking, if you don't smoke. And at the time they were so committed, they were so passionate about doing something about HIV. You could rely on them, you could depend on them, because there was this sense of solidarity. There wasn't sympathy. I mean, there was a real commitment and a real earnest sense of we will put this together. At the time, I was working at the AIDS Consortium with Edwin Cameron and Morna Cornell, and we had developed the AIDS Charter on the rights and responsibilities of people living with HIV. So we were going to have a big launch of the charter, and then we were going to lead into Nkosa. The PWA movement, for want of a better word, there wasn't a movement at all in 91, 92. There was a group which I co-founded with Johan van Rooy and Noel Pillay called Body Positive. It was a very small group, Joburg based, of predominantly HIV positive gay men who came together, who would care for each other, feed each other, visit each other in hospice. And then the Nkosa conference came about, and they, at the time it was hip to include a personal testimony of a person living with HIV in any conference program. And it was always a personal testimony. There hardly ever was the person's name or who they were or whatever. And I shared the stage with Nelson Mandela at the time, who was, it was just such a mind-boggling experience. That was the first time that I met him.
He was about to become, this is before he became...
Yeah, because Nkosa was in 92 and he became president in 94. I grew up as pretty much a typical white South African boy with mixed parents, as in English Afrikaans, completely protected by my parents and by the system. I did not hear the word apartheid until about standard 8. So I was 15, 16. I did not understand the implications and consequences of apartheid until my final year at school and when I started university.
And then you found yourself sharing a stage with Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
Was that something else you had to disclose to your parents, or were they fairly politically liberal?
No, unfortunately, my parents are and always have been very conservative, politically.
Okay.
So when at university I became politically more aware and asked them questions of what is apartheid and who is Nelson Mandela, and it was almost shock horror, how can you mention that in this house? And that was for me very difficult.
Shaun, you were a shopping list of disappointments to your parents.
Oh yes, yes, yes. Unfortunately, I was, and it continued for a few years after that. But yeah, no, it was a big.
So there you. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I diverted you a bit, but you were on stage with Nelson Mandela, and you were going to tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was the big conference to draw up the part of the national plan for South Africa post-apartheid government. And there were 2 slots for people with HIV. It was myself and a young guy called Paulus Dladla, who could hardly speak a word of English. But he came from KwaZulu-Natal, and he was willing to be open about his HIV status. I have no idea whether he's alive still, where he is, or whatever happened to him. He spoke in isiZulu at the conference, and I translated his speech because we worked together. It was a very short 5 minutes talking about the impact that it had on him. And then I also gave my presentation. I can remember very little about what I said. I remember that I became very emotional towards the end of my presentation. I remember a complete standing ovation from the audience, and I remember Quraisha Abdul Karim coming up on stage, who was supposed to talk about the epidemiology of HIV in South Africa at the time, immediately after me, saying, "Shaun, how can I talk after you?" And the rest was a blur. I have tried to find my speech from the Nkosa archives. Unfortunately, I'm not sure whether they have any of those initial papers, because I would like to remember the things that I said. I mean, I know I took a long time on the speech. It was for me incredibly powerful.
So you suddenly found yourself
I had an identity. I had a place. I was affirmed. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer the person just in the media. People knew me more. I mean, they understood my emotions. I recall the presentation beginning something like, name Mellors Shaun, age 24, crime, testing HIV positive, description white homosexual male. So it was as if I was in a court case and the audience was my jury, and I was kind of being presented to the court and my crimes against humanity, so to speak. So it came from a very personal place, because then there was not necessarily the need for accountability, because I was not representing anyone, because there wasn't an organized movement at the time. So having personal testimony was appropriate and was relevant and was very powerful. I learned the accountability as we became more organized as a movement, as we became more structured, as we had to have elections to nominate the chair and the vice chair and the treasurer and all those aspects. So that was 92. I think in 93, I might get my dates wrong, but in 93, the people with HIV representatives on NCOSA, because I now had a seat on NCOSA, I was affirmed as a person with HIV representative on NCOSA. We asked NCOSA for funding to organize a meeting for people with HIV. And we organized the very first meeting at the Tropicana Hotel on the beachfront here in Durban. There was about 80 people with HIV from all over the country, black and white, who came together to become organized, because we wanted some kind of structure. Edwin Cameron came as a guest speaker because he wasn't open about his HIV status at the time. So he came as a guest speaker. A few of us were aware that he was HIV positive, but also understood the struggle that he had about coming out with HIV. And at the end of the conference, we had our first election. So who's going to be the representatives of people with HIV? And amongst the conference participants, we had the elections, and I was elected as the chair of this new organization of people with HIV. And that's when we tried to become more organized as a movement, with the establishment of the National Association of People Living with HIV. That's what the body became known as, NAPWA. But in true South African style, there was a splinter group that was formed. I think it was called Positive Living or Positive Life. Vincent Veal was the person who started the splinter group. And that, interestingly enough, is how the PWA movement has almost remained fractured and splintered. And I'll talk a bit about that further on in my story, with the almost split of the Treatment Action Campaign and the National Association of People with HIV and AIDS. In 93, there was again the International Conference for People with HIV, and that was in Acapulco, Mexico, which was again a wonderful experience. And as the chair of the National Association, I was allowed to attend on behalf of South Africa.
There was funding for that? Where did the money come from?
That came from the World Health Organization, actually. The majority, and actually from one of the drug companies. I think it was, I'm thinking GlaxoSmithKline, but that's not what they were called at the time. The people who made AZT. It was them, because at the time it was only monotherapy which was available, which was AZT, so they also sponsored a bit about it. And at the Acapulco meeting, I was nominated onto the board of the Global Network of People Living with HIV, which had 3 representatives from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean. So all the Africans and who were there got together, and they nominated people. And I then spoke to people with HIV in South Africa, and we decided to put in a bid to organize the 1995 conference for people with HIV. And we were granted the bid. And from the 6th to the 10th of March 1995, I'll never forget those dates, we had one of the most amazing conferences and experiences, I think, in the history of the PWA movement.
That was the year after the...
Exactly.
victory.
It was the year after the changeover. The international community was dying to come to South Africa. There was this great sense of euphoria amongst all the conference participants. I remember sharing the opening stage with Thabo Mbeki, who at the time was the deputy president, and Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who was the Minister of Health. At the end of my opening speech at that conference, Thabo Mbeki came to me and hugged me, because I was emotional as well. I can be a bit of an emotional queen, or I was a bit of an emotional queen, not anymore. Thabo Mbeki also said at that conference that an injustice to one is an injustice to all. We must all fight HIV. So in 1995, he was deeply committed to HIV. He believed strongly in the principles that we were all trying to fight for, which was inclusion, that HIV causes AIDS, that people need support, that people need care. And he gave a fairly good speech at that conference. And somewhere in the archives it is on film. I think the photographer Gideon Mendel has got loads of photographs of the conference. We even got Kenneth Kaunda to come to the conference, because at the time he had just come out about losing his son. So he also came to the conference, and we had the quilt project on the lawn in Sea Point, amongst.
So there was a South African quilt project.
It was part of the international quilt. It was part of the international quilt that came, but we do now have a South African quilt project. It's not as effective, unfortunately, as the international one was. But there we had these memories, of all these dead people on the lawn amongst all these rich apartment blocks, and all these grannies and grandpas were walking along the beach, and, oh, what lovely quilts, what are these about? Oh, it's about dead people. Oh, and there was shock and scandal and horror, and it was really incredible for me. So at the time, there was commitment from government. There was commitment from Dlamini Zuma in terms of ensuring that people with HIV had a place, and that there was support for people with HIV. And then after that conference, I then left South Africa, because I was appointed as the executive director of the global network of people living with HIV and AIDS. And that's when I moved to Amsterdam from 95 to 1999, when I was in Amsterdam. So what happened post 95, I was obviously involved from a distance as the head of the global network of people living with HIV and AIDS. And that's when Peter Bassi took over the National Association of People Living with HIV. Yeah. A lovely, gentle, sweet, amazing man who I miss dearly. But also at the time, Zaki Ahmed came to the National Association of People with HIV. This was post the Cape Town conference, and was talking about the need for the National Association of People with HIV to become more activist, to have a treatment activist program. I think it was actually post 96, because all the drugs became available at the Vancouver conference. It was announced that the drugs were available. And at the time, the National Association of People with HIV, as I understand it, felt that they could not become too political. And that's when the split was even more reinforced, and the TAC became more of an activist organization, became more focused on issues of treatment, trying to mobilize, become more of the social movement. And I came back to South Africa in 1999 to work on the International AIDS Conference, which was going to be held in July 2000. I was aware that there was a huge increase in HIV. I mean, at the time I wasn't paying much attention to antenatal. I think when I left South Africa, and I'll have to look at the statistics, I mean, I think there was something like 200,000 people living with HIV. When I came back in 1999, it was 2.4 million. So, I mean, there was this huge, and yeah, and it was for me, first, have they got better at reporting or understanding the issues? But in between those 5 years, I mean, I'd obviously meet up with activists at international AIDS conferences, or I'll meet that cow, Mantu Shabalala Misimang, at conferences. And I always knew she was drunk when she came up to me and hugged me. When she wasn't drunk, she'd walk straight past me and ignore me. But when she was drunk, Shaun, big hug, come running up to me and give me a big hug, wherever she was. When she was sober,
Boozy hug from Mantu.
yeah,
Delightful.
a vodka smelling, yeah, which was just incredibly nauseating. The speaking terms came from the Nkosa days, and
Okay. Yeah.
where we would sit around the table talking about the national strategy, what we're going to do, the different interventions, how we're going to have an impact. And then in the run-up to the South African AIDS Conference, the International AIDS Conference in South Africa, I had a lot more interaction with her and the Department of Health. And at one of the press conferences during the International AIDS Conference, she came walking into the press room, and I was standing at the entrance of the media room, and she was obviously sober, because I mean she was nasty, and she said, "How, you are still alive?" And I said, "Yes, I am, and it's because of ARVs." And she said, "Those things are going to poison you," and off she minced to the head table. And then I also saw one day on a plane flying between Joburg and Durban, and I had a conference bag with all the drug companies' logos on it. And she pointed her finger at me like this, and she said, "You and your people, these drugs are going to kill you."
Your people?
Yeah.
Who did she mean by your people?
Other people with HIV. Because she painted all people with HIV with the same stroke, people who were on treatment.
Okay, so she distinguished between people on
Yeah.
treatment and people not on
Yeah,
treatment.
because people not on treatment were poor, they needed her help. She needed to make decisions for them. She had to provide them with answers to their problems. The empowered ones, not important to her. It was 2000. 2000 during the AIDS conference. I knew that there were problems in the Department of Health already in, I think, 96 or 97, I'm not sure, when Nkosazana was the Minister of Health and the whole Sarafina scandal. And at the time, Croatia Abdul Karim was the Director General of the AIDS program. And she left the program in protest at what was happening within the Department of Health. And I have had and always have had a great deal of respect for both Croatia and Slim. And when Croatia walked out, then I knew there are serious problems within the Department of Health. And I also heard about the Virodine scandal when I was overseas. And that's when they were trying to poison people with HIV with this whole new drug. Yeah, exactly. And it's, I mean, there's a fascinating story around that whole Virodine scandal and the involvement of Thabo Mbeki and the ANC. And so it's really interesting to, as that part of our history. And I mean, in the organization of our conference, there was complete blockage from the Ministry of Health, even from the presidency at the time, because that's when Thabo Mbeki pulled together this presidential council on coming to a consensus on what is the link between HIV and AIDS. And that's when he invited all these dissidents to be part of this council. So all this was happening in the lead up to the conference. And the international community was saying, we can't come to South Africa because the government does not believe that HIV causes AIDS, apart from the international community saying that Africa can't organize an international AIDS conference. So in the beginning of the conference, everyone said it's going to be a flop, you can't organize it, it's not going to happen, nobody's going to come. Yeah, but fortunately people voted with their feet. And the AIDS 2000 conference was the turning point for treatment in the developing world. Because when people left this conference, it was no longer a question if, but a question of when treatment is going to become available in the developing world, and especially in South Africa. And people often forget that powerful aspect of the International AIDS Conference in Durban.
A paradigm change?
It was a huge, I mean, so big. Even the International AIDS Society and the international scientists who were here. I think even the South African government then realized, because soon after that they started getting the treatment guidelines and things slowly started changing.
But that must have been for Minister Manto the laying of battle lines.
Oh, sure. That's when all the court cases came. I mean, the Neveropain court case and the challenges with the treatment action came, because the highlight for the treatment action campaign was also the AIDS 2000 conference. I mean, it was for them an incredible, affirming, powerful process. And when they organized the treatment march at the beginning of the International AIDS Conference, where Winnie Mandela was marching with them, all these international people were marching from the Durban City Hall to the AIDS conference here, where they just refused to receive any memorandum about treatment or whatever. So the conference, I think it was the conference chairpersons who actually received the memo. And during the AIDS conference, when Nkosi Johnson was coming to do a press interview, and that cow was walking down the passage, and I was holding Nkosi's hand together with Gail Johnson, and she came up to him and she said, "You naughty little boy," because of what he had said the night before about that pregnant woman should be given nevirapine, that if his mother was given nevirapine, he would be healthy and whatever. And the poor little child was just tears in his eyes. And this woman was pointing her fingers, and you naughty little boy, how can you do that? How can you say those things? And it was, she was weird. She was sick at times. She was scary. And that's what I remember about her at the AIDS conference. I think also big people, not just small children and animals. And it took a long while to bring about that change. I mean, I think treatment guidelines were developed in 2004, which started the big rollout of treatment. And she hated it. She hated it that she had to roll out treatment. The movement of people with HIV in South Africa is very fragmented, because during this problem with the Minister of Health, the TAC was obviously taking her to court, was obviously fighting against her, while she was coordinating with the National Association of People with HIV. So she was getting her affirmation from NAPWA. She was giving them loads of money, says, don't implement programs because you good people, you aren't fighting against me. So all the grants for mobilization of people with HIV went to the National Association of People with HIV. Some say there was a lot of corruption there. I tend to agree with it, because they never accounted for the money. They've had leadership for the last 10, 15 years, which has never changed. And that reinforced the split between the TAC and the NAPWA, because TAC had a cause that they were fighting for, and NAPWA were in the pocket of the aggressor. I think at the time it was for them more an issue of becoming mobilized, getting people to access grants, and they did that fairly well. I mean, they had a very good grassroots structure, and they were very good in advocating for social grants for people with HIV. So that is, to their credit, one of their achievements. And they also managed to organize and mobilize people with HIV to a certain point. So they were fairly good in aspects.
Were they sort of taking in Manto's doctrine of nutrition and
yes,
Matthias
very
Raj
much.
and so on and so on?
Very much. Which was also a flashpoint for the treatment action campaign, because they were reinforcing the doctrine that HIV is not necessarily the cause of AIDS. It's poverty, it's malnutrition, it's all the things that the government at the time were saying. And I think that's partly why they were so successful in getting social grants, because you need to live healthy, you need to be able to eat properly.
Well, there's nothing wrong with addressing social determinants of health, and there's no need to reject biomedicine at the same time.
Yeah, but I think people do funny things when you are vulnerable. And at the time, treatment wasn't available for many people with HIV in the public healthcare sector. It was available in the private sector. But if your body is, well, I'm challenging myself as I say this, but if your body is riddled with candidiasis and you are getting very thin and very frail, you kind of grasp onto any straw. And if somebody says that you must eat beetroot and garlic and lemon juice or drink a certain substance, you will do that. And if somebody says, I can give you lots of money to organize yourself, to set up chapters in every province. I can sort of understand why they went that way. In hindsight, I think it's a load of crap. I mean, they should have argued and fought against it, but I think as human beings, we are very funny people. There was a lot of that. And she promoted it to as much as she could. And that's also why TAC was often excluded from policy decisions or discussions that took place because she had her lapdog. And so the National Association of People with HIV would give the rubber stamp of approval, saying people with HIV support this. I don't think that the tensions between NAPWA and the TAC have been ironed out, even today in 2011. I think that the leadership of NAPWA is problematic because they've been in office forever. They aren't elected, they were appointed by the minister. But within the chapters, there is some collaboration between the TAC and NAPWA. And at the Positive Convention that we had last year, there was an attempt to bring the different groupings of people with HIV together. But it hasn't happened.
Solve the historical grudge.
Yeah, it hasn't. And I think it's, and that's why when we talk about the new sense of activism, until there is this inspiration again, or until there is this common cause which everybody can identify with and agree with, I don't think there will be a unified movement, so to speak. And it begs the question, is there a need for a unified moment? But I think it's partly also a problem of defining activism and understanding that there's activism at different levels. Because I think many people in South Africa have the concept of activism is fighting against the government. And that's their understanding of activism. So now when the government's providing treatment and the government's playing nicely, what is activism about? How do we define activism again? Because we have everything. And I think that treatment has had a huge impact on activism. It has taken away that sense of urgency. It has taken away that sense of passion that I'm dying, my friends are dying, I need to be angry, I need to fight for treatment. But now I'm okay. I have treatment and my friend has treatment and I can't make too many loud noises in case it's taken away. I'm comfortable, I'm happy. And I think that is what's happening with activism internationally as well. I don't think it's just in South Africa. And that's, I think, also what I refer to as activism on different levels. Because if I look at our treatment program and I see our clients who are prepared to sit in queues for 8 or 9 hours, who are prepared to take lousy treatment from healthcare providers, and I say are prepared to take very lightly, because I think there is a need for individual activism, that those people, the clients in those situations, have to find a voice to bring about change, because it can't just be Section 27 and the TAC on this level who talk about the big picture activism or the big picture campaigns. change happens on that individual level, where that person or that woman finds the courage to open her voice and say, I am tired of sitting in this queue for 6 hours. And I mean, service delivery protests is trying to address very basic needs of people. The AIDS struggle was trying to meet very basic needs of people. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a clear connection between the service delivery protests and the early AIDS protests. Oh, it's fine. I mean, I changed from an activist to become a retired, cynical, jaded politician a few years ago.
Actually, do you feel co-opted?
I don't feel co-opted. I feel disillusioned.
Why?
The movement, I think both in South Africa and internationally, became driven by personalities, became driven by personal agendas, and we kind of, yeah, and we kind of lost sense of what it was that we were doing. And I was just getting hurtful. I was just getting tired of having to fight with divas and big personalities. And at one stage I was becoming a diva myself and a big personality myself. And I just thought, I can't do this. This is not me. And that's when I just decided to take a step. And it was hard for me because it was something that's affirmed me for all these past 26 years or whatever.
Not just affirm, but define you.
Yeah. And now all of a sudden I'm
You were bloody good at it by the sound of it.
Shaun, the healthcare manager, who's like having a bit of an identity crisis.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, what do we do with old retired activists? I mean, because sure, there's always activism. Exactly. So we remember that one. But there's always activism in me. And I think the person who spoke at the end of that session, defining the difference between activism and activists, is critically important. I mean, that activism will always be in me.
Yeah.
But an activist, I mean, I think it's important to be able to differentiate when it's appropriate to be an activist and when it's appropriate to be a politician or a diplomat or a manager. And I've learned that over the years. I think it was a process of survival, a process of understanding the environment and understanding the landscape and what needed to be done. Because even with activism in 2011 can't be what activism was in 1988, because it's a very different type of activism. It has become professionalized, which is also something which a few activists say, that it is a profession. I mean, it takes years and loads of money and loads of investments to create a Mark Hayward or a Shaun Mellors or a Zaki Ahmad. It does not happen overnight. And all of a sudden we expect everyone to be well-defined, articulate activists. And so to redefine that entire agenda also isn't just going to happen overnight. It is going to take new people, new investments, new ideologies, new thinking to move it forward. And there has to be that sense of urgency. I don't see any sense of urgency in trying to define a new agenda. It's...
Do you see complacency?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
People taking things for granted.
Yeah, and that's what's happened with treatment. I mean, people with HIV have become complacent. I think that we failed, that we failed them, as in the people who are no longer with us, and that it was a genocide, and it's hard to explain or justify a genocide because you are often not aware that it's happening until after the fact. Or if you are aware that it's happening at the time, it's very difficult to do anything because you're fighting for your own survival. You are worried about what's happening. You're fighting against the system. It's, and I somehow related to Auschwitz and people being put in the gas chambers, and so many of those stories are never going to be heard or never going to be told, and they've just become a number in South Africa's HIV epidemic. Yeah, it's become a graph, but they are somebody's opa grootjie or somebody's mother or somebody's father or somebody's brother, and I think that it is a very dark, sad part of our new democratic history. And history will judge us harshly and has to judge us harshly for that, because it is very sad.